birds aren't real. In 2017, one man started a movement that would eventually convince thousands of people that birds weren't real. What began as a joke protest sign in Memphis quickly spiraled into one of the most successful conspiracy theories of the modern age. But while Peter meant it as all satire, he had accidentally stumbled onto something true. The CIA really had tried to use birds as surveillance tools during the Cold War. Digging deeper, we uncover 3 very disturbing unsolved mysteries. You won't want to miss this one. In 2017, Peter McIndo stood on a street corner in Memphis, Tennessee, holding up a sign that read, "Birds aren't real." He was protesting against another protest happening nearby. A few people walking past stopped and asked him what his sign meant. Peter told them that birds were actually government surveillance drones. Now at first, this was just Peter being silly. He thought it would be funny to create this totally absurd counter-protest. But something unexpected happened. People started actually believing him, and pretty soon, Peter's little joke began taking on a life of its own. His "birds aren't real" message started appearing on social media. People began making their own signs. They printed flyers. They bought billboards. The movement was exploding, and pretty soon, before people knew it, people started to believe that birds don't really exist. This one simple message went completely viral.
Birds aren't real! Birds aren't real! Birds aren't real!
Now, according to the theory, if you could even call it that, the United States of America invented the Central Intelligence Agency with the explicit purpose of spying on its citizens. As the story goes, sometime between the late 1950s and early 1970s, all the birds in the country were exterminated using B-52 bombers specially outfitted to spread poison only lethal to birds. What we see today aren't birds, but actually highly sophisticated miniaturized drones used to keep tabs on the population. Each so-called bird contains a high-resolution camera. So think of them as sophisticated miniature surveillance drones. The theory even had explanations for everyday bird behavior. When birds pooped on your car, that was actually the drone marking your vehicle to track your movements. And those birds sitting on the power lines, they weren't getting electrocuted because they were actually robots recharging their batteries. More specifically, the drones use energy sources like high-tension power lines to recharge without having to return to a home base. And with so many power sources readily available, these miniaturized robots can travel indefinitely. The movement got so big that it started incorporating other conspiracies. They claimed President Kennedy wasn't killed because of the mob or the CIA. He was actually assassinated because he was going to tell Americans the truth about the bird drones. And Area 51 doesn't hold a crashed alien spaceship. It's ground zero for manufacturing these bird drones, including a bird terminator called the Turkey X500, used to hunt down the last few actual birds roaming our skies. But folks, I'm sorry to break it to you, but in 2021, Peter finally revealed the truth.
This is the first time that I've ever broken character in an interview. I have been playing a character for the past 5 years who believes that every bird is a surveillance drone and who's part of a larger movement called the Birds Aren't Real movement. Never leaving character, even in like behind the scenes conversations with journalists or anything, so.
He had created it to point out how ridiculous conspiracy theories could be, and he wanted to show how easy it was for completely false information to spread. After the idea took off, he found that keeping the fake theory alive had turned into a full-time job. Through the sale of Birds Aren't Real merchandise alone, he and his business partner were making thousands a month. Nowadays, lots of conspiracy theorists think that if there's anything legitimate at all to the Birds Aren't Real movement, it's that Peter is actually being paid by the Central Intelligence Agency to perpetuate a psyops to make conspiracy theorists look like fools. The ironic thing was, Peter had accidentally stumbled onto something real. While birds obviously aren't government drones, the CIA really did try to use birds for surveillance during the Cold War. In fact, his idea was shockingly close to actual documented projects spearheaded by the CIA. A 2019 Freedom of Information Act request, submitted at the height of Birds Aren't Real's popularity, uncovered a March 25, 1976 memo for the CIA's Director of Research and Development. It clearly reads, in no uncertain terms, a technical collection team has been formed to demonstrate the operational utility of an aviation asset. As a part of this effort, a new bird camera has been designed which weighs less than the old one and which uses a 16mm film with motion compensation instead of the 9mm size. Testing of this camera will continue through June of this year, at which time the final demonstration is scheduled. That's right. Nearly half a century ago, the CIA was experimenting with using birds as surveillance tools. And not only that, the documents hint that this was part of an ongoing effort. While the idea that birds are actually tiny, super sophisticated drones is obviously a joke, the core idea of birds aren't real is 100% true. The intelligence community of the United States has tried to use birds as vectors for surveillance. But how deep does this rabbit hole go? And how successful was it? Were their targets the American people or solely foreign actors? Since the 1960s, they tried training a red-tailed hawk to carry out camera missions over Soviet territory. The early tests went well, but there was a problem. Red-tailed hawks were protected birds that couldn't legally be transported outside the US. Yeah, that's kind of an issue. So the idea was scrapped, at least the version using a red-tailed hawk. The CIA shifted its focus to using crows fitted with cameras. No restrictions there. But when they started looking into it, they realized that the project wasn't as feasible as they thought. The crows just couldn't reliably fly far away and return home without being dropped off close by. To get the crows to the surveillance site, they'd have to get a boat not only through the Baltic Sea, but up dozens of waterways closely monitored by Soviet forces. But folks, the CIA didn't give up. In the 1970s, they launched the Takana project using homing pigeons. These spy pigeons successfully carried cameras to Soviet facilities and brought back the film. What exactly they photographed remains classified even today. Another bird used during the Cold War was the raven. The CIA had a trained raven that they used to drop off and pick up small items. And since ravens are a bit more free-spirited than homing pigeons, the CIA had to get creative with how they used the bird. They eventually trained the raven to fly up to a point they indicated with a flashing laser pointer, and once it landed, the raven would either pick up something an agent had left behind, or even more valuable, leave behind a surveillance device on a spot like a windowsill to listen to conversations. Then, a specially designed lamp would lure the raven back to its handlers, and they actually used this raven on at least one mission in Europe, but the listening devices it placed picked up too much street noise to be useful. The closest that the CIA ever got to full-on birds aren't real territory was a little thing called Project Aqualine. Around 1965, officials decided that they could gather intelligence about Soviet nuclear programs through the use of aerial drones disguised to resemble large birds. Aqualine means like an eagle. These drones would sample the air to measure Soviet nuclear capabilities and transmit data back to spy planes. And just like the birds aren't real conspiracy theory states, these bird drones were supposed to be able to recharge themselves, but instead of using power lines, they would convert waste heat from radioactive isotopes into electricity using a special propulsion system. And in another strange parallel to the conspiracy, Project Aqualine really was headquartered at Area 51. Now, the project was eventually canceled, though the exact reasons remain unclear. Could it be because of
Hey. After consulting with the legal team, we shouldn't do that.
Right. So while Peter McIndoe created Birds Aren't Real as a joke to mock conspiracy theories, he accidentally hit surprisingly close to the truth. The CIA really had spent decades trying to use birds, both real and robotic, to spy on people. The only difference was that the real CIA bird surveillance programs were much smaller in scale and far less successful than the conspiracy theory imagined. But it does make you wonder, what if Project Aqualine wasn't canceled? What if it continued, or what if it got rolled into a new initiative? It's enough to make you wonder, even though most birds are real, how many might not be? That is a very disturbing mystery. Back in the 1960s, the US military had a serious problem. They needed a way to protect ships and recover equipment from deep underwater, but human divers just weren't cutting it. The water was too cold, too deep, and humans were too slow. And so one day, somebody at the Pentagon had an idea. They looked out at the ocean and thought, why are we trying to make humans do this job when there are already perfect candidates dolphins swimming around out there. That's when the US Navy Marine Mammal Program was born. And to this day, this program is still running strong out of San Diego, California. At any given time, the US government has about 70 dolphins and 30 sea lions just waiting to be deployed. The military has used them in actual combat zones. Dolphins were deployed during the Vietnam War and both Gulf Wars. They've helped locate mines, guard ships against enemy divers, and even rescue people lost at sea. But here's where things get really interesting. The US wasn't the only country with this idea. You see, the Soviets had their own dolphin program too, and while that program supposedly shut down in the 90s, something happened in 2019 that made people wonder if maybe it hadn't really ended at all. A fisherman off the coast of Norway was out checking his nets when he noticed something strange in the water. There was this beluga whale, totally white, just swimming around his boat, and normally belugas don't come anywhere near fishing boats, but this one, it was off, it was different, and it was swimming right up to the boat like it wanted something. And so when he looked closer, he noticed this was wearing some kind of harness. The harness had "Equipment of St. Petersburg" written on it in Russian. And the fisherman managed to get the harness off the whale, and when marine experts looked at it, they realized this was different. This harness was specifically designed to hold cameras or weapons. And this particular beluga, they figured out, was probably trained to guard naval bases and maybe even attack enemy divers underwater. There's something else I want to talk to you about. It's weird and fascinating, but it is a sensitive subject. In fact, if you're a pet lover, you might want to skip ahead because it's kind of disturbing. I wasn't kidding when I mentioned disturbing mysteries. Both the American and Russian governments have also used dogs and cats for espionage, and the results weren't always pretty. The intelligence communities of both countries have had a long-standing interest in things like telepathy and extrasensory perception. Obviously, both of these could be immeasurable help on the battlefield, and as far back as the 1920s and 30s, the Soviets were trying to see if human beings could mentally communicate with animals. Now, after World War II, Americans took a more direct approach. They started implanting electrodes directly into the brains of mammals like dogs, in the hope that they can control their actions or send them on specific routes into enemy territory by using radio signals. There are hints that these operations even included venomous animals like snakes. The hope was that maybe they could be used to covertly assassinate enemies while maintaining an appearance of plausible deniability. Now, by far the strangest and most disturbing experiment was something called Acoustic Kitty. No, not like that. The CIA came up with this idea in the 1960s. They thought to themselves, you know what would make a great spy? A cat. I mean, if you think about it, cats can go basically anywhere they want. Nobody questions a cat walking around. They're quiet, they're stealthy, they can get really close to people without raising any suspicion. And so the CIA just figured they could send these cats into enemy territory and possibly inside the Kremlin itself, like ordinary strays, while secretly gathering intelligence. It sounded like the perfect idea. There was just one small problem. Cats can't talk. They can't tell you what they've heard, and this is where things get dark. The CIA's solution was to turn these cats into living recording devices. They had hired veterinary surgeons to perform this incredibly invasive surgery, for lack of better words. And for a full hour, these surgeons would basically work to turn a regular house cat into a spy. They started by implanting a tiny microphone right into the cat's ear canal. Then, they had to install a small radio transmitter at the base of the cat's skull. The wire was then woven into the cat's fur so that it would go unnoticed. And when all was said and done, the subjects looked no different than an ordinary house cat. And the CIA really thought they had something there. They were sure these cats would be perfect. You know that phrase that something difficult is like herding cats? Well, the geniuses at the CIA discovered that firsthand. At any rate, all these procedures, from research and development to the surgeries themselves, ended up costing American taxpayers $20 million. No worries, right? It's okay, big brother. We'll front the cost. Now, if you think this whole catastrophe can't get any worse, see what I did there? Buckle up, because it does. The first field test of Acoustic Kitty was a complete disaster. The CIA picked their target, two people having a conversation in a park near the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. They had their cat ready to go. Everything was set up. They released the cat close to the targets. And what happened next was so bad that it seems like a joke. The cat didn't even make it 10 feet. A taxi cab came out of nowhere and hit the cat. Meow! Do I really need to say what happened next? But the story may have a silver lining. Because in 2013, a former CIA director named Robert Wallace came forward with a different version of the story. His claim was that the taxi story was just a rumor. The cat actually survived, and after they took all the equipment out and the cat went on to live a long, happy life. But I'm not sure that I'm buying that. I mean, the CIA had just poured millions of dollars into this project. They'd invested all these resources into R&D, and then they just decide to take everything out and let the cat retire? Well, it wasn't until 1967 that the CIA finally admitted Acoustic Kitty was a failure. They realized you just can't expect a cat to follow orders. I mean, cats are going to do whatever they want, whenever they want. I love how it took them millions of dollars, time, and research to figure that one out. Good grief. Now, even despite this admission, Acoustic Kitty remained classified until 2001, when it was released along with other CIA documents, granting us a glimpse into one of the most bizarre chapters of espionage during America's struggle against the Soviet Union. Now, this is probably the strangest segment. So we've seen how the intelligence community likes to use real animals, and we've seen attempts at building drones in shapes of animals so that they will go unnoticed. But have any of these attempts succeeded? Another very strange and disturbing strategy was implemented by the British, and it dealt with rats. During World War II, the British Special Operations Executive, SOE, developed an innovative sabotage device known as the explosive rat or rat bomb in 1941. The concept involved filling rat carcasses with plastic explosives, which would be strategically placed near German boiler rooms and coal storage facilities. The SOE procured approximately 100 rodents, claiming they were for medical experiments. After the rats were killed, plastic explosives were carefully sewn inside them. Each rat could be equipped with either an immediate or delayed fuse. The reasoning behind this strategy was based on standard operating procedure. When workers found dead rats among coal piles, they would typically dispose of them by throwing them into the furnace. While a rat could only contain a small amount of explosive, the penetration of a highly pressurized steam boiler could potentially trigger a devastating explosion. However, the first and only shipment of explosive rats was intercepted by German forces at the border. While the rats never achieved their intended destructive purpose, the psychological impact proved significant. The Germans exhibited the captured rats at their top military schools and conducted extensive searches for more booby-trapped rodents across their territories. The SOE ultimately considered this unintended outcome a success, noting that the trouble caused to them was a much greater success to us than if the rats had actually been used. While some historical accounts claim that 9 Belgian factory boilers were damaged by the rats, this is likely a myth according to verified historical records. Now, I'm not going to lie, this last section gets a bit fishy. Back in the 1990s, the CIA created something that sounds like it came straight out of a cartoon. Let me introduce you to Charlie. Charlie is your friendly neighborhood robo-catfish. He was invented in the 90s by, you guessed it, our good friends at the CIA. This unmanned underwater vehicle was designed with the purpose of testing the feasibility of using submersible drones to gather intelligence. Charlie was designed to be an underwater spy. He looked exactly like a catfish on the outside, but inside this 2-foot-long robot fish was a complex system of surveillance equipment. He had a pressure hull, a ballast system, and an advanced communication setup. His tail section concealed a sophisticated propulsion system. The CIA could control Charlie using a handheld radio device. They'd guide him to the water, gathering whatever intelligence they needed. Now, a lot about Charlie's actual mission remains classified to this day, but Charlie wasn't the CIA's first attempt at creating animal-based surveillance. Back in the 1970s, they had an even more ambitious project called the Insectothopter. This tiny spy drone was disguised as a dragonfly, and it was an incredible piece of engineering for its time. Inside its head was a microphone no bigger than a bead, and it could transmit audio back to a receiver using a laser system. The whole thing ran on a miniature propellant gas system. The CIA knew they needed someone with extremely precise technical skills to build something this small and functional, and so they brought in a watchmaker. And this person helped them create a miniaturized fluidic oscillator that can make the wings move just like a real dragonfly. Unfortunately, the slightest breeze would send this thing crashing straight to the ground, and so officially, the CIA abandoned the project and declassified all the files. But you know the story by now. Just because it's officially given up on, it doesn't mean that the project is dead. The CIA might have given up on the bird drones, but they didn't give up on tiny flying spies. They just went smaller. By 2010, the US Air Force revealed they had been developing what they called MAVs, micro air vehicles. These tiny robots were the size of bumblebees, some even as small as mosquitoes. Then, in 2015, the Air Force announced something that sounded like science fiction. They were working on what they called lethal mini drones. And the strangest part was these drones were based on Leonardo da Vinci's blueprints for his flying machine. After these announcements came out, obviously a lot of people had questions. Nobody really knew how advanced things had gotten behind the scenes, but earlier this year, researchers in the Netherlands made a breakthrough. They developed what they called a 5-layer spiking neural network with almost 29,000 neurons that could process raw camera data in real time. Yikes. In simple terms, they created a vision system that can control swarms of micro-drones. Because this system handled all the navigation, the drones themselves could be incredibly tiny. They were basically nano-drones, but unfortunately for them, they're incredibly fragile, just like the original Dragonfly drone that couldn't handle a breeze. Well, in 2023, researchers at MIT created bug-sized robots that have the capability to withstand significant damage to their mechanical muscles, known as actuators. Robots were designed to be resilient enough to take a licking and keep flying. Not only that, they're working on a laser repair technique that, in the future, might be able to actually repair any damage that these insect-sized robots sustain over the course of their missions. Now, sometimes the most effective surveillance isn't drones with fancy cameras or high-tech equipment, but instead might be happening through something we see every single day and never think twice about. Nick Pope sat at his desk in early 2023 and explained to a reporter from the Mirror newspaper something that made the reporter do a double take. Nick told the reporter that aliens were likely monitoring Earth right now, but not from distant telescopes or satellites. Instead, Nick believed aliens were watching us through the eyes of seagulls and houseflies. He had actually worked as the official UFO investigator for Britain's Ministry of Defense. And during his time there, he had access to all sorts of classified UFO reports and military intelligence about potential alien activity. After leaving his government position, Nick became a journalist who specialized in writing about UFOs and extraterrestrial activity. And over the years, he had made several notable observations about alien behavior. He told people that aliens were afraid of Vladimir Putin. He said they really liked Queen Elizabeth II. And he warned that if humans ever made first contact with aliens, it probably wouldn't end well for humans. If aliens wanted to monitor Earth up close, they would need to do it in a way that wouldn't draw attention. And what better way to spy on humans than to use creatures that were already all around us, something that humans see every single day and never think twice about? To support his theory, Nick brought up how human military technology had evolved. He explained that aircraft like stealth fighters and stealth bombers had been flying for years before the public knew anything about them. And if human military could keep those massive aircraft secret, imagine what an advanced alien civilization could do with tiny drones the size of insects. Nick said that the military already had public versions of bird-sized and insect-sized drones, and those were just the ones they let people see. He suggested there were likely far more advanced versions hidden away in secret facilities. capabilities. Nick pointed out that if aliens really were preparing for some kind of invasion or takeover of Earth, they would need detailed intelligence about human behavior. They would want to study how humans lived, how they interacted, what their routines were, and what better way to gather that intelligence than through creatures that were already in people's homes and public spaces. Aliens wouldn't need to replace all of them. They would only need to control or replace enough to maintain constant surveillance. Controlling actual living creatures might even be preferable to using drones. Nick told the reporter that people often asked him why. If aliens were really watching us, they hadn't made their presence known. They were still gathering intelligence. They were studying human behavior, patterns, and weaknesses through these everyday creatures. The most advanced technology was always kept secret. Whatever technology the public currently sees and has availability to, the military has significantly more advanced technology, which makes us wonder, what are their intentions for all of this technology? Is it nefarious, or is it to gain control over other territories and countries? That, folks, and everything else we discussed will remain a mystery. And because you guys have made it this far into the video, I want you to comment below, birds aren't real. So that way I know who made it to the end and who didn't. And if you guys enjoy storytelling like this, where we dive into strange cases of the mysterious and supernatural, what are you waiting for? Smack that like and subscribe button for more content just like this. As always, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next video.